So that's the number, before I move on, of the number of fatalities on the road in the United States in 2018 because of car accidents. This number, right, a lot of studies have shown that this number can be greatly reduced because of autonomous vehicle technology, because you take out things like human error, right? It's like, oh, I think I can make that red light, like, you know, that light turning from yellow to red, and then you accidentally cross into somebody who's actually kind of eager to go on the green, right?
We're especially excited because Dr. Alex Wyglinski is here with us tonight from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And we're going to dive into how autonomous vehicles work and learn how wireless communication between vehicles, roadside units, and off-site services can make the roads safer for everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our speaker this evening.
So you see wireless connectivity. So that's where, you know, sort of my core competency, my core strengths are. What I love doing day in, day out. I teach about it, I talk about it, I do research about, I invent. How does this connect to vehicles, right? So what I'm going to be talking about is, we talk about autonomous vehicles. The last 4 to 5 years, we've been hearing a lot about it. We hear about how great it is, how people can, you know, essentially let go of the wheel and it'll take care of everything between point A and point B. We also hear a lot about the challenges of autonomous vehicles, right? We hear about, unfortunately, some accidents, some fatalities, some issues that, you know, the best of the best minds around the world are trying to figure out how to make these platforms more reliable, more secure, safer, and more importantly, can we then take this technology such that it becomes mainstream? We'll see not just 1 or 2 self-driving cars, but we'll see, you know, self-driving cars mingling with human-operated vehicles out on the road. And not just cars, but buses, minibuses, taxis, even things like bicycles. I've heard about autonomous bicycles. I don't know how that's going to work, but it's very exciting to hear all about it. So when thinking about like autonomous vehicles, why does this resonate so strongly in today's society? It's because we're a mobility society. Look at the urban planning of our country, right? Like, in order to, you know, get groceries, you know, we usually take a vehicle, maybe public transportation, maybe our own vehicle, maybe an Uber or some sort of rideshare, to go from our homes or place of employment over to a store, right, to pick up groceries, or to a sports game, or to a movie theater, right? So our entire urban planning, our entire society revolves around the ability to conveniently go from point A to point B, right? So that's great, but there's a lot of us, right? There's also this idea that our infrastructure, which was built in the 1950s and 1960s, like the latest, like, you know, the interstate system, obviously within, in an urban environment, especially older cities like Boston, like New York City, and like cities like these, the infrastructure is way older, right? And yet more people drive personal vehicles, right? And there are more vehicles on the road in general, and we end up getting something like this. This is actually what the Mass Pike looks like going westbound in the evening. This is actually me in my car, on my dash cam, and this is exactly what I see, right? And so how does this mobility now, which is supposed to improve my quality of life, right, now turns into something like this, where I spend a good portion of my life now in a vehicle trying to get from that point A to point B. And that's sort of that promise, one of the promises of autonomous vehicles. This idea that autonomous vehicles, among other things, is like, you know, takes the driver out of the loop. I can now, let's say, that long commute home, let's say if I go from Boston to Worcester, right, back to WPI, I could sleep. I can catch up on some reading. I can have a teleconference call, right, while the car does the driving for me. Like, imagine that, stop and go. Not too difficult, is it? So there's actually a lot of possibilities behind autonomous vehicles. So it's not only something that's technological. Wow, it's cool. It's like blinky lights. It's like, you know, this thing that will be able to take care of itself and I don't have to worry about it and you can tell your friends. Autonomous vehicle has great promises, has great potential. Safety is one of them. What's other factors? So people don't think about things like, for instance, supporting mobility of folks that cannot drive. What about people with let's say, disabilities, physical or otherwise, where they cannot operate a vehicle? What about children? Let's say the parents are like, I'm sorry, I'm stuck at a meeting. Send the autonomous vehicle to pick them up and bring them home, right? How about also green technology? What about the ability for the vehicle to, like, let's say, for instance, I take public transportation as far as some sort of bus stop, but I still have 2 miles to walk, if I had to walk, from that bus stop to my house somewhere in the suburbs. An autonomous vehicle rideshare can come and pick me up and take me over to, let's say, my house a couple of miles away. Even things like, for instance, economically, this makes a lot of sense. Like, so for instance, if let's say you look at places like an inner city, right? Where, let's say, if it's an economically challenged area where the cost of car ownership is quite prohibitive. Cost of insurance, cost of parking, cost of the vehicle itself, right? Maintenance of that vehicle. Instead of that, what happens instead? We have our own an autonomous vehicle that's shared between 4, 5, 6 users. Maybe it's even part of the public transportation infrastructure. Right? So all of this promise, all of this hope in this technology, there's a lot more happening here than just saying, this is cool technology, let's build upon it. It's about how it can really positively change society, right? That's why people are jumping into it. Not only that, the technology that's used in order to support autonomous vehicles has reached a stage where, for once, it's actually quite viable, that we can produce it on a very large scale. Right? So talk about autonomous vehicles has happened ever since the 1920s, right? And then people are saying, oh, what happens if I try this, try that? But there's several key ingredients here that now make autonomous vehicle a viable commercial option that we can deploy on the roads, and it's not going to cost a mint, right? So things like computing technology. Computing technology has reached a stage where you can put in machine learning to interpret the environment around you and really make decisions close to, maybe not exactly, but to the capabilities of an actual human driver. Then we have sensing technologies like radar, which is quite mature, vision processing quite mature. We have LIDAR that's evolving and has great promise also to interpret the environment around us and classify objects, what the road conditions are. So I've mentioned a lot of these technologies, right? So that's the number, before I move on, of the number of fatalities on the road in the United States in 2018 because of car accidents. This number, right, a lot of studies have shown that this number can be greatly reduced because of autonomous vehicle technology because you take out things like human error, right? It's like, oh, I think I can make that red light, like, that light turning from yellow to red, and then you accidentally cross into somebody who's actually kind of eager to go on the green, right? Like an autonomous vehicle should not and will not make that mistake. It's going to follow whatever the policies is programmed into it in order to avoid, let's say, incidences that cause something like that type of collision, that type of fatal situation. Okay. So how do we achieve reliable autonomous vehicles? So I mentioned technologies, LIDAR, radar, vision systems, sometimes sonar as well, right? They all kind of point to one very important concept, okay, which is situational awareness, right? We do that. We're in a car, right? So I don't have LIDAR in my head. I have a vision system, but it's different than that of a camera system and with all that computing processing. I don't have radar on me. What happens is as a driver, I require situational awareness. I use my ears. Do I hear fire or police sirens? Am I in danger? Should I need to pull over by the side of the road? Obviously, I use my eyes, right? Also things like, for instance, sense. Like I feel the steering column of my car, and I detect that, maybe I'm driving on ice or snow or some sort of pavement that I need to be very careful about, right? So a car needs, and that artificial intelligence, most people are pointing towards AI, machine learning, in order to make the decisions that a human driver would need to make in order to control and act accordingly in an environment surrounding that vehicle, right? So the LIDAR, the radar, the vision systems and such provide that sort of awareness, that understanding of what's going around my environment, and allows the vehicle to make the appropriate decision in turn, right? Otherwise, you have car accidents. You have decisions that make absolutely no sense to the environment. But here's the problem. So LIDAR, radar, vision systems, how far do they extend out? LIDAR, maybe 100 meters, right? Radar, maybe that far as well. Vision systems, as far as the eye can see, literally. But there's a problem, right? What about the car after that car? What about what's behind that building, behind that forest, behind that blind turn? I have a great example of what I mean, right, in a couple of minutes. So the idea is there a technology that would enable us to go beyond what we call line of sight, to see beyond that, like, the physical environment around us, to give us that additional edge, that additional situational awareness. So the decision-making process on the autonomous vehicle might not be so great, like as a human being. It will be close. The more horsepower you put into that computer making all those decisions, and the more you train that artificial intelligence, it will probably come up with some really good decisions, right? But we need a game changer such that maybe it's not as good as a human being, a human operator, right, in terms of decision making, but it will have more information that human beings may or may not have, right? And so this is what I'm talking about. So information sources. So sensors. So whenever you talk to somebody in the autonomous vehicle world, when they think of information sources, they think of the LIDAR sensors, they think of the radar sources, they think of the vision system, the camera. This is actually an example, okay, of what a radar unit now looks like in the bumper of your vehicle, right? And they use a technology called millimeter wave in order to send wireless signals out in front of it, and the first thing that it collides with, those radar waves will actually reflect back, and they're actually collected by that device. And then based on that range to target, it's going to say, oh, that car is only, let's say 50 feet away. And then that goes into your artificial intelligence that says, oh, heads up, that car is 50 feet away, and just a couple of seconds ago it was 150 feet away. It must be coming to a stop. You can extrapolate, let's say, based on the data, that sensing data, where the vehicle in front of you, which is quite important, is. But also things like if you have sensors around the vehicle, is there anybody in your blind spot? Oh, I hate it when people are in my blind spot. Yeah, and yet that's a very real problem. As humans, we have difficulty with blind spots. What do you think about an autonomous vehicle, right? So this is a perfect example. If you use line of sight type of technologies like radar and LIDAR and image systems, you quickly lose that edge of situational awareness. So what we have here, this is actually my street. This is a legitimate street in Massachusetts, in winter, of course, so that's only a few months away. And what ends up happening is there's still much more street. This is a dead end, but there's still much more street behind that wooded, the woods there. In fact, this is one of 2 blind turns going uphill on a snowy and icy street in a dead end somewhere in central Massachusetts, right? Do you know if there's a 10-ton truck coming down? I don't see it, right? And so what happens is if you don't see danger until it's too late, what ends up happening is you have something like this. So that's actually my car. And the scene we just saw, that actually was the photograph of the day after where I got into a car accident with said truck. I didn't see it coming. I had snow tires on my car. I was driving really safely. Unfortunately, gravity wins when you have a really heavy vehicle in an icy street, and nothing's going to stop it, right? Luckily, seatbelts and airbags do really well. They do save lives. My wife and I came out walking, right? But could have that been avoided? And the answer is yes. I personally think yes, because there's another technology that is not bounded by how far you can see or until you hit the first object. That's wireless communications, okay? So wireless communications, the way it would work in the scenario I just described is, let's say there's a beacon, there's a transponder, there's some sort of emission, and there are technologies already out there that allow us to actually be able to point out, what do they call it? Basic service messages that come out of a vehicle and say, here I am, here's my GPS location, this is the direction I'm driving, this is the speed I'm going, right? And repeats it ever so often such that all the cars around you, every vehicle, knows where you are, and you do the same, okay? There's an actual standard out there that vehicles, if they are built with this technology, can follow. And there are other ways as well, knowing wirelessly if there's vehicles behind, let's say, what we call non-line of sight conditions. So yeah, definitely wireless connectivity can save lives. It can keep us safer because it provides, what I want to call a sixth sense, right? So wireless is already on the road. So here's some more of those wonderful shots. So any of you driving on the Mass Pike or anywhere in Massachusetts, you're going to see this wireless technology in action. So this is the first one. I love this. So here we are, and look at the sign to the right, that green sign. And it gives you real-time time updates to where, let's say, a major intersection is or a major exit. That's wireless technology. The way that works is there's actually wireless sensors next to the road that are reading, let's say, Bluetooth signals coming from your car. So Bluetooth has, like data, which is encrypted or should be encrypted and shouldn't be, should not be read. It's not allowed to be read. But it also has something called a header and has a unique identifier in that header. And what this network does is it records you at one point and says, this vehicle with this Bluetooth header is at this location. And then 5 miles down the road, it says it traversed this amount of time, and it's that same vehicle. So there's a way of tagging that vehicle along the way, and then it extracts how long it will take you to get to that point, and to, let's say, that specific intersection, and share that time information with vehicles behind you. So that's actually all over the state right now, right? So I always wondered how that worked until I talked with folks who actually implemented the system for Mass DOT, Massachusetts Department of Transportation. Here's another one. So here's a Tesla. And you might say, okay, Tesla. We see this all over the place. This is like, one of the main cars in Massachusetts, right? What ends up happening is that Tesla is gathering data and wirelessly transmitting it back to Tesla on things like how is it driving, how is it performing, especially if it's in self-driving mode. So that's another form where the wireless connectivities with a cellular network, which a lot of people have looked at as a way of seeing, can we make cars safer that way? In terms but in this case, the Tesla is gathering information around it. That situational awareness is being sent, to some central location where what you can do is, let's say the manufacturer, right, can use that information in some way to improve their product, to make it safer, to make it more reliable. Okay? Especially that artificial intelligence, no joke. That artificial intelligence will take a lot of data to train it. Finally, this is my favorite. This is where, especially if you're on the Mass Pike, you pay the piper, right? Every time you go on the Mass Pike. So it used to be toll booths, now it's all e-tolling. And so all those guys, right, that array, that gantry has sensors that are picking up the little transponder that you have on your windshield, right? And it says, we're going to charge this person $1.25 because they went this far on the Mass Pike so far, right? And so that's another kind of use case where we use wireless technology for e-tolling. So just to recap, so some examples of wireless technology used on the road right now are things like e-tolling. It's sort of like distance updates on dynamic signage on the road, and also gathering of information by, let's say, more or less intelligent vehicles and sending it back to a company in order to do, let's say, enhancement of, let's say, that vehicle for future deployments, or maybe even a service, firmware update for that vehicle itself. So in terms of the wireless connectivity, so what we've talked about is, we already see it deployed on the road, and it's used kind of more like in things like infrastructure. It's sort of like, things like, how do you collect a toll more efficiently, which is great. I also talked about a little bit about where potentially we can use wireless connectivity to save lives, but it's not clear. I've kind of held that back. And the reason why I haven't gone into yet how wireless connectivity can be used for autonomous vehicles is because we still don't really know how to use it. There's this big ongoing debate right now on different ways of connecting vehicles wirelessly so they can exchange information and then ultimately support self-driving operation. So the jury's out. I'm part of that wireless community. We're still trying to figure out what's the best way of having cars wirelessly connect with each other, with the infrastructure around it, in order to support things like autonomous driving. So the research questions, the biggies, right? These are kind of the hard ones. This is what my grad students and I are trying to do, are things like choosing the right wireless connection. People don't know. Right now, there are two camps, which I'll explain. There's the camp that says, if you want to talk to a car, so let's say you're driving and I'm driving, what will happen is they should talk directly. Very hard problem. Super hard problem. The other camp says, no. Use the cellular network. There's this thing called 5G. It's a game changer, no problem. But there are issues with that too. It's simpler, but it uses infrastructure, and there's more delay. Because now if I want to talk to, let's say, the car in front of me, or the car in front of me wants to talk to me saying, dear, right? If we use 5G networks, right, we would need to communicate it to a base station maybe a mile or two away, and then relay it to, let's say me, just maybe 100 feet behind that vehicle. Is the latency critical? Could it cause me to have an accident? Is that an issue? Absolutely. So they're both camps are trying to figure out, and I think at the end of the day, there's going to be a hybrid solution coming out of this. The next thing is, great, we have this wireless connectivity. How many cars did we have in that video of rush hour heading out of Boston? Hundreds? Maybe, I'm not going to say thousands, but there was lots, right? Can you accommodate wirelessly all those vehicles? Is there enough channel bandwidth to accommodate all of them? That is also a really, really difficult situation. Especially in the United States, there's only 75 megahertz. 75 megahertz. That's not a lot. That's basically 7 channels of bandwidth, right, to support all vehicular communications in the United States. Now, it sounds bad, but it's not as bad in the sense that wireless spectrum occupancy, the amount of channel bandwidth is very local. All I need is a free channel between you and me, right? Or you and me. And then if you go far enough away, our communications can't be heard by the vehicles ahead or behind us by, half a mile. But nevertheless, what happens if there's hundreds of vehicles swarming us and they all want to use those channels? That's a problem. Lastly, let's suppose we all are talking and we somehow have independent channels. There is what we call out-of-band emissions. Like my communications, right? Like for instance, I'm talking right now, I have a mic on. If I'm sufficiently loud, the people in the library are going to get very annoyed, right? I consider that like out-of-band emissions, right? My voice should only be in this space but spilling over into other adjacent spaces. That's a big problem in the wireless communications world, right? So let's say, first of all, the battle for the right wireless technology. How do we deal with it? Who's going to win? What are those options? So first of all, there's 2 standards, right, that define this vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity. One's called WAVE. It's set by IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, right? It's one of the world's largest professional organizations for electrical and computer engineers, right? 500,000 members strong. They do, among other things, industry standards. They set 2 standards. One is WAVE, right? Wireless access for vehicle, and I forgot what the E stands for. But it's IEEE 1609. And then the other one is dedicated short-range communications, IEEE 802.11p. It's a variant of Wi-Fi. So these 2 support vehicle-to-vehicle communications. Right? So here, suppose you have a bunch of vehicles. The way this would work is they would all be traveling, and then let's say something urgent comes up, like there's deer in front, which I don't think we ever have that in Massachusetts, right? So what ends up happening is these vehicles say, I think there's a deer, pass it on. Then you pass it on. Then you pass this warning progressively all the way down to all relevant vehicles to say, heads up, I think there's danger. Perfect example of wireless communications, that 6th sense in action. Especially if you're on a blind turn, and especially if there's a whole bunch of cars blocking you from actually seeing that deer. Perfect. So we call that vehicle-to-vehicle, or V2V. There's also the contender, right? The other solution is 5G. It's 4G, but it has a lot more bandwidth, it has a lot more capabilities, and potentially the deployment is going to have better coverage across this country, right? And so the way that works, right, is you have your road, you have a bunch of cars, and just like how you would use your cell phone, you would be talking with, instead of the vehicle directly, you would pass that message to some sort of cell phone tower, right? And it would have the capacity to support hundreds of vehicles and relay that information to the other vehicles saying, oh, there's deer, be careful. The problem is, again, is that delay. We call it latency. Okay? In the connected vehicle world, in the wireless connectivity for vehicle world, latency is death. So imagine like you're driving, and then all of a sudden you get a message, like you don't get that message that the car suddenly, like in front of you, stopped because it's trying to avoid hitting a deer, and your car still keeps on driving, hits, gets into a collision, and then you get the message saying, oh, by the way, the car ahead of you just stopped, right? Bad news. So, but I can assure you the folks with the 5G community are working super hard. This is their #1 challenge, is to bring that latency down to 0. You have to, okay? And that's V to I, vehicle to infrastructure. Wireless access, so there are many different ways to do wireless access, but one way that my research students, my graduate students and I, in collaboration with several faculty colleagues of mine in biology, is we're using this biological concept called foraging theory, right? So, one of my colleagues, he's a bumblebee expert, and bumblebees, the way they look for flowers and trying to find which flower gives the most reward, okay? They sample all flowers, they say, which one gives the most rewards? Oh, blue flowers. Which ones give the least rewards? Oh, red flowers. And so they don't waste their time, just like us. Like, the certain grocery stores have the product I want. Like, oh, this couscous here is supposed to be excellent. And that couscous there, not so good, and the box size is not so great. So what ends up happening is we sample, the bumblebees sample flowers, and then we decide to go with what we think is the optimal, the best choice, and we just keep on going to only, let's say in the case of bumblebees, blue flowers, and for us, that grocery store that has a really good couscous. And then occasionally we periodically check to see if maybe the red flowers, or in our case, the other stores have better couscous. And maybe we're surprised. Maybe suddenly that shipment was just a bad one and we have a better shipment. So you could do the exact same thing with wireless channels. So let me show you. So first of all, here's my colleague, Rob Giguère. So he was at WPI, and he's the bumblebee man, okay? And so what we did is, suppose you have like this little model. Like, I'm going to explain a little bit of biology, but I'm not a biology expert, okay? Last time I took it was like grade 11. So what bumblebees do is they say, okay, here's a bunch of flowers, and it's going to visit a whole bunch of flowers, and it's going to say, okay, out of all these flowers, it turns out that the red ones were actually to yield the most nectar. So I'm only going to go and visit red flowers. But occasionally, I'm going to revisit, that bumblebee is going to revisit, and then discover maybe this time the reward was actually better with the blue flowers that other time, for whatever reason, right? And it keeps on adapting and adapting, adapting. Same thing about wireless channels. Wireless channels, some are very busy, right? So let's look at traffic with cars. Sometimes wireless channels, like the red indicates occupancy. The vertical stovepipes, the vertical columns, is your channel, right, over time. So the vertical axis is time. Any channel that's completely black is really good. Why? Because then I can transmit in it, and I don't have to fight with somebody that's transmitting in red around me. So I can take advantage, in this case, of channels 2, 4, and 5, and 8. And I'd rather stay away from channels 1, 3, 7, and 9 because there's activity. I'm going to collide. I'm going to interfere. I want to avoid that. In this case, my algorithm, my bumblebee algorithm, sampled the wireless channels and said, I'm going to go with 5. Then a little time later, what I discover is that channel 5 is now getting really busy for some oddball reason. And if I'm forced to, if the reward goes below a certain threshold, that's where I say, okay, instead, I'm now going to go to channel, I think I said channel 3. And survey says 3. Perfect. So at the end of the day, my radios, each one of the radios on my cars that are trying to talk with each other, will only change channel if they absolutely have to, if the reward falls below some certain threshold. And it uses this bumblebee behavioral model based on foraging theory in order to achieve that. Okay? Lastly, minimizing interference. This is a little bit of a confusing image, but it's so cool, so I just wanted to put there. What this looks like, all these sort of patterns, all this energy that seems to be, like all these colored blotches pointing in a specific direction, we can use some signal processing techniques to focus wireless energy in one direction. So let's say we're all driving in this direction, right? And you, sir, want to talk with me. Instead of sending wireless information, wireless energy all out and blast everyone and interfere with everyone, you can actually do some really cool signal processing and project your wireless signal only to me and really eliminate any wireless energy flowing out to anyone else. And I can do the same. So we can have this communications and minimize interference to the rest of you. And all of you can form these individual wireless links without interfering your neighbors, right? And so both this and the Bumblebee project, I need to mention, are both supported by the National Science Foundation. So in 2015, we received a generous award from National Science Foundation because trying to figure out ways of cars to talk with each other in challenged wireless environments where we have limited bandwidth is really important. And then to make sure that we're able to do that without interfering, right, is where this NSF award from 2016 comes into play, where we try and minimize interference outside of, let's say, the person we want to talk with. Okay. So with that, you're all great. This was really, hopefully this provided you with some insight of what I'm doing, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thanks. So, great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you use any open source software technologies, and can you talk about that?
Sure. So some of the, so when we do a lot of this research, like we have a variety of different types of scientific softwares that we use. So for things like mathematical analysis, data analysis and such, most of my students and I, we use like something called MATLAB, which is produced by the MathWorks. It's a company just like down the street in Natick. With respect to, let's say, implementing radios and such, so we do in my lab, I didn't have any photographs of it, but in my research lab, we do a lot of prototyping of wireless communication systems. And so for that, we use a variety of different software packages. So first of all, MATLAB actually implements radio systems, but there's also something called GNU Radio, which is completely open source that you can download, you can modify, you can, if you want to make it into a Wi-Fi router, you can program it to become a Wi-Fi router. So a lot of the research I do in my lab, we usually program our radios using either one or several of these types of software packages. And main reason is that computer simulation is great. It'll show us some insight into what we should be seeing, at least ballpark-wise, like how a system would perform, like for instance, that bumblebee algorithm. But ultimately, there are assumptions and sort of simplifications we make in the simulation. So when we actually transition it over to hardware, like radio hardware, that's when we use something called software-defined radio. And that's where things like GNU Radio and MATLAB come into play.
Can you talk about the security concerns?
Excellent question. So yes, so in fact at WPI, so we do a lot of, I had several undergraduate student projects as well as one master's thesis that looked at automotive cybersecurity. And that is a huge, huge concern. Even in conventional cars, there is approximately 100, 120 electronic control units or ECUs that control everything from your power steering to your automatic transmission to your power windows and seats, like windshield wipers, everything, right? And so it's on a computerized network called a CAN bus, controller area network bus. And so there have been several demonstrations of that where folks are able to hack into that network. Maybe they already are on the network and they show, hey, look, I could make this car stop or turn off the brakes or something along those lines. That's definitely been published. I think there's a big push now that, for instance, connectivity is like opening up Pandora's box, right? So what ends up happening is somebody who shouldn't be communicating with that vehicle is communicating with that vehicle, is offloading, let's say, who knows what, and then compromises that vehicle to, and does scary stuff to it, right? And that is a concern, at many different levels. And even with respect to things like vehicle-to-vehicle communications, forget about even that. It's possible to remotely take down vehicles. So for instance, there have been demonstrated attacks where you can use something called tire pressure monitoring sensors. So TPMS. So I think that was made mandatory in 2008, where what happens is you have these sensors. Most cars that carry them, in the United States, at the stub, the stem of your air valve that goes into the tire, there's a little computer and there's also a sensor for pressure and there's a sensor for temperature. And then that wirelessly connects to a little base station in your vehicle that then goes to the rest of your car's CAN bus. And then if the tire pressure is too low or the temperature is wrong, you're going to get that little tire light lamp, little light on your dashboard saying there's a problem with your tires. There have been demonstrated attacks going through that. And it's not that hard. I have an undergraduate student project putting together using one of those software-defined radios, made themselves look like a tire pressure monitoring sensor and was able to go into a vehicle. right? And then of course there's a Bluetooth on your car's entertainment system. That's a way of, so there are many different ways of and that's even before I would say 5G networks is relatively safe. So it depends on who's the recipient of the communications with that vehicle, if they're slipping in, let's say, viruses or anything like that. V2V is a little bit more scary because you don't know if the person's authenticated or not, right? So so let's say in that diagram that I have, I know I'm rambling, but this is a super important problem. What happens is, let's say in all of this, you have one car that's going through and it's trying to connect with everybody and feeding them, let's say, viruses and stuff. That could be a really serious issue. Okay, good question.
Do you have any perspective to offer on the economic ramifications that the self-driving vehicles will have, say, for Uber or taxis, maybe trucking industries or the sub-economic parts of the trucking industry?
Perfect. That's an excellent question. So yes. So what happens is right now there is in terms of the trucking industry, there's always seems to be a shortage of, let's say, drivers, right? You always see those advertisements like, drive for me at 1-800 blah, 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 blah on the back of the truck. So there's simply not enough truckers out there. So there is a high demand. And there is some, I actually had an undergraduate student project at WPI look at the parallels between this and also the airline industry, which is highly automated. So there's a lot of autonomous technology. The amount of actual human driving in a plane is kind of like it would be frightening if you see how little there is. And also autonomous agriculture, that's another factor. So there's these interesting parallels between all of them. And with both agriculture and with airlines, there were always shortage of labor. There was always shortage of drivers. There was shortage of pilots. And then the stopgap was this autonomous technology, trying to sort of fill that gap. So in terms of autonomous trucking, that is definitely one of those kind of really important markets that this technology can really make a big impact because of first of all, drivers, also endurance. Right? These drivers, they have a very specific window that they need to get the product they're shipping from point A to point B, and could be very clear across the country. The cover image that I had on my first slide here, that was actually when my wife and I drove across country together with our dog. We went from Boston to San Francisco, and I can tell you, just that alone was quite the trek. I can't imagine people doing that for a job multiple times a week and such. And we've seen incidences where, trucks were you can see, the driver might not be paying attention, or worse yet, conditions like tire blowouts or very nasty crosswinds and such. So the idea of autonomous trucking is very powerful. In terms of rideshare, in terms of, let's say, sort of technologies or applications that would supplement public transportation, absolutely important. We need to have this. There are big efforts where what happens is, what I was mentioning before with, let's say, economically challenged areas where folks really can't afford a car. And yet mobility is also, among other things, an opportunity for jobs, right? And better quality of life, for healthcare, for school. So this opens up that opportunity. Why own a car? Why be sort of challenged even more economically when you have this great resource?
I've recently read that the 5G network, as it rolls out, is really going to be for streaming and cell phone use for the first lot of years, and that they're not really going to do much for IoT until it's built out. Do you have any updated information on that?
No, that's about right. So yeah, right now, 5G, the way it's looking is just 4G, but with a lot more bandwidth, a lot more coverage. The IoT part, the Internet of Things part, really, you're right, 2025, I think, is when we're going to start having commercially viable IoT devices. Because, for instance, one of the technologies that they're trying to rely on, which is millimeter wave, to me, it's just a researcher, the viability of having a millimeter wave link being let's say if I'm just a regular homeowner and I say I'm going to make a IoT light switch and then an IoT lamp and stuff, and the two should connect to each other. I'm wondering how would those systems adapt to find out where their locations are and create that link, and then do it on a massive scale throughout a house. I just can't see it. Related to automotive, There are sort of additions, like, the next few releases of LTE, right? The standards for LTE, they're looking at like super low latency modes. They're also trying to sort of start going down that vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity as well through the IoT mode as well. But again, in terms of like just like overall like 5G, yeah, like there's a lot of hype in terms of bandwidth, and rightfully so, because another part of my research looks at spectral availability, like, people having broadband access throughout the entire country. And you might think like, well, like that's impossible. Everyone has broadband connectivity. Well, like as an example, bring up the town of Princeton, Massachusetts. Princeton is about 45 miles, 50 miles away from here, and they don't have broadband in town. They're under this situation where they did not have, like, for the longest time, they were relying on dial-up and other sort of like very low data rate technologies in order to connect with the outside world. Now the town has taken a major effort to actually build in broadband, but it's very expensive, right? 5G will be that sort of, the technology where, you don't have like cable modem or Fios or anything in your area or any sort of like optical communications, no problem. There's a 5G base station. It will beam straight to your home. It will distribute all that broadband connectivity across your house and your household. But in terms of IoT, you're right. IoT is going to take a little bit longer to roll out. Like I think just the cost of the devices alone, like the price point, it's going to take a while. Like yeah.
So assuming massive adoption does happen with autonomous vehicles, I guess in a situation where you have sort of rogue or bad actors, I guess how does the wireless connectivity account for, say, a system where you have 4 out of the 8 cars are autonomous and then 4 are not? Is there sort of a fail-safe to address that sort of issue?
Well, what's interesting is, I'm trying to think of a good answer to that. So we're going to have to come up with a good answer for the next 10 to 15 years, because unlike cell phones where we change them every year, every 2 years, cars, we don't throw away cars. Well, I hope we don't throw away cars every 1 to 2 years. Like, with cars, like the way I drive my cars and my wife is we hold on to them for 10, 12 years until like one of several things happen. They either like completely the wheels pop off one day and go to car heaven, or get into like car accidents and stuff. So we're going to have to be able to coexist with, let's say, human operated vehicles and then the self-driving vehicles. And it comes back down to the same premise that I started off everything with, which is the situational awareness. We have to have, those autonomous vehicles need to know where the human operated vehicles are. So from using just LIDAR technology and radar and vision systems, like that alone, around your immediate surroundings, you'll be able to find out who's around you, right? They may be autonomous, they may not be. But as for, like, let's say the entire traffic flow, there are, like, there are probably other ways of, like, can you identify where the human operated vehicles are, especially if, let's say, for instance, they may or may not be participating directly. They're like, they don't have a radio on them. But like, so for instance, one example is things like, we do have like location services. Like there's several major companies that do a lot of like, store data, keep data. Like, like let's say even applications where we, have those maps and say you have this much traffic, that same data could probably be used, but you'll need higher location resolution, of course, right, down to which lane, in order to say, oh, this vehicle's in this lane, that vehicle's in that lane, and all you need is really a human driver with a cell phone. Now, here's the interesting question. What happens if you have a person driving like a 1956, pickup truck who doesn't believe in cell phones? That then is kind of like that, mysterious phantom car that's driving that nobody can see. And then in which case you have really no problem. Like you really do have a problem. You have to either see it with LIDAR, radar, or vision, but beyond that, you can't. But on the other hand, going back to this diagram, that's an excellent question. Let's go back here. So this way. What happens if, let's say, that car that says the exclamation mark sees that phantom car with no wireless connectivity, no technology whatsoever, it can share its experiences. So this is the other thing. Autonomous vehicles are going to come out of the garage, okay, with an artificial intelligence, It's going to come out of the garage saying, this is how you're supposed to drive in this country or this state or this city. This is what signage looks like. And here's sort of a basic set of skills that you need to know how to drive. But then what will happen is that the cars then start building up their own experiences. It's just like how we learn. It's a reason why they're called artificial intelligence. There's an intelligence. There's a part where you add to that artificial intelligence. You add more experiences. And what will happen is, let's say that vehicle is going to share its experiences with all the other vehicles, and they're going to learn accordingly. So that's what's going to happen is, like, I think the cars immediately around are going to sense it, and then they will be responsible for sharing that location with everyone else around.
Have you seen a model trained locally on a vehicle that improves its performance and learns?
Not a vehicle, but from other places where there's machine learning applications, yeah. Like, so what happens is, usually what happens is you have like a multi-tier approach where you have, like, let's say, local sensors. And then the local sensors, what they do is they triage the data. So because the thing is, what's going to get you is the bandwidth. So going back to like the spectrum model, where like we have limited channel bandwidth here and there and everywhere, and we have to contest with hundreds of other vehicles, we're going to have to somehow triage that information to what is absolutely necessary. So a machine learning algorithm will be necessary there for that filtering. And then from there, that information that gets passed over to a data fusion center, and that could be in the cloud, and that can do additional sort of processing on that information, and then pass it back down to the vehicles.
My question is like, so let's talk about peer-to-peer or even in wireless where we have a infrastructure in between. Now, is it possible that, the data gets corrupt from one bad actor in this, like in this case, if we have the second car started, sending out corrupt data. So is there a way for the third car who's receiving this data to verify it, whether that data is corrupt or not? Because there can be corruption, there can be corruption in the data. There can be corruption in the way, like things like checksum, for example, on a very basic level. There can be corruption at data and at the checksum.
Yep.
So how can, because if there is a corruption in data, this entire thing can, be a really big mess.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So like for instance, the idea of like, let's say in this vehicular network, even like, if we turn to like Wi-Fi, like man-in-the-middle attacks and such, and Sybil attacks, those are some really serious attacks where it's very difficult to detect. It is possible to detect, but there's also, it's cat and mouse. So then people come up with ways to kind of hide their identity even more and prevent, let's say, people identifying that they're in the middle somewhere. So you're absolutely right. Like, and I think the main thing here is there's going to be, like, there's obviously going to have to be some level of encryption. And not only between the vehicle, right? So there needs to be some sort of encryption. It needs to be standardized so that all auto manufacturers, as well as their OEMs and whoever's providing them the parts for this, will also have to agree on these standards so that, like, you don't take advantage of, let's say, the weakness of one standard over, let's say, the strength of another in order to compromise the overall network of these vehicles. The other thing that's important is the CAN bus, traditionally for the longest time, has also been wide open. It's been is unencrypted. And that is a huge concern. So if you want to, like, let's say, then compromise things like the brakes, although I'm trying to think, vital systems are on a different bus. But nevertheless, the issue is that we're taking, first of all, legacy systems. We're also taking an environment where there's not necessarily like any sort of standard. There's the IEEE 802.11p and WAVE, but I think, I'm trying to think which one's cybersecurity. I think it's 1609.2? Yeah, 2.4 I think is multi-channel, which is trying to address that. But even then, there's still much more work that needs to be done in order to prevent what exactly the scenario you're saying, which is someone who is a bad actor joining a network, and then it's trying to compromise the vehicles around it.
So I've seen scenarios in like airplanes where one of their sensors stop working, or there's a conflicting data between the sensors.
Oh yeah.
And they give control to the pilot. So similarly in this case, if your physical sensors are giving you some data, which should not be, or if it's just conflicting data.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So let's say if it gets like kind of erroneous data that's not making any sense to the autonomous vehicle, how it hands over to a human operator? Is that what you're saying?
So in a way, if we have a scenario where the autonomous car, it's getting conflicting data from different sensors, and it hands over back, to the human.
Yep.
Now, human here, it's controlling the car and not the other cars.
Yep.
So how is that interaction going to happen? Because
Yeah, well, just like I talked about a little bit before. So what happens is, so obviously it's going to detach from the network. Well, no, I take that back. So the V2V will always be there, right? It's the autonomy that will be deactivated on the part of that vehicle. Hopefully, and I think I mentioned this before this presentation to a few folks, there's something called graceful failure. So we hope that when the autonomous vehicle says, I give up, I can't do this anymore, it sort of says you have 10 seconds to take over the vehicle, otherwise you crash, right? And so we really do hope that human takes control in time, the human operator. But the wireless connectivity is still going to be there, right? How it now drives in formation with everybody else, especially if you're doing something like platooning, well, that's going to be part of that graceful failure, right? So connectivity, let's say, supports things like platooning. So when you talk about platooning, so people might say, what the heck is platooning? So platooning is when you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cars. More common, and what's really attractive, especially in the trucking industry, is you have several trucks in a line. What happens is the first truck takes most of the brunt of the aerodynamic, the sort of the oncoming sort of resistance of the air, but then following that, like the air resistance is actually very minimal if the trucks are close enough together. So now, let's say we go to your example, where let's say now one of those cars says, I can't do this. There will have to be a protocol within the autonomous vehicles where that vehicle, first of all, hands over control to a human operator, and then that vehicle needs a brake formation. Which also happens if, let's say, one of those vehicles says, that's my exit, and needs to peel off and go off that exit, and then the platoon gets shorter, or vice versa if it gets added, right? But I think that, so the connectivity is always there. But in terms of the autonomous vehicle and how it is able to sort of drive safely, especially if they're very closely coordinated with each other, I would assume that if, let's say, controls being handed over to a human, the rest of the platoon would be informed as well.
similar to this case, because since everything will be connected on an internet or a network,
yep.
So I think I assume that individual cars, they will be, if there's an infrastructure in place, so probably every car would have an IP, so to say, as in, to individually identify, because we have a network in place, we have a cloud in place, which we are connecting to the car. So we have a device IP,
yeah.
Correct?
Okay, sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, now there are things like something that we studied long back, something called UDP and TCP, where UDP, it just sends data, it doesn't matter whether it has been received or not, where in TCP you have all sorts of congestion control, flow control, and it will wait for it, but that causes a performance delay.
Yep.
So in this case, I think the performance is really, really important.
Yep.
So what kind of protocols would be aligned towards UDP or TCP? Because both of them have their drawbacks and their pros.
Yep. So that's an excellent question. I think since minimizing delay, minimizing latency is of the utmost importance, like UDP over TCP would make sense in this. If it's using these types of protocols, but the reason for that is you want to shovel as much information, especially if it's emergency information, from let's say one vehicle to another, and unfortunately, if packets are dropped and such, then that is definitely that's a concern. But the latency is the major issue, right? We want to keep, because if you do TCP/IP, right, or it's like, oh, did you get my message? No. Can you please resend? By the time I'm done, boom, I've just had a car collision. So UDP would be preferred, but you do increase the risk of, if it's corrupted, how do I know that the receiving vehicle got it in the first place or not? Okay.
Awesome. Can we give Alex a round of applause? Thank you so much.